Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Southern Outdoorsman Podcast. Today, we're showing South Carolina a little bit of love, which we don't do as often as we should, as often as we'd like. Today, we're talking to Mr. Mark Haslam. Mark, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, gentlemen. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate the invite.
Yeah, glad to have you, Jacob. How you doing over here?
Doing well, doing well. Mark, this has been kind of a long time coming because I think we originally talked about doing this episode. I think it was last year. It was at least last year, maybe even 2 years ago. I don't know. I've been kind of kicking around trying to get you on, talking, velvet hunting, and just y'all's crazy season y'all have, especially in your part of South Carolina. There's the opportunities that arise starting in mid-August. But the thing about you, I've
hmm
kind of been following you for a couple years now, is your consistency of success on your farms, just killing really, really nice bucks, really good bucks. Throughout the season, and that's something that I really want to kind of talk about because again, South Carolina is such an interesting state. We actually get quite a few listeners all the time ask us, man, I would love for y'all to come hunt South Carolina. And, we've looked around some different pieces of public land down there, and it's like the seasons are just crazy. And also with it being, I guess it's called blue law state, or the whole situation where you
Yeah,
can only hunt public land on, Saturdays. You
Saturdays.
can't hunt on Sundays until I think this year they opened up a few different ones. It's been
Yeah.
interesting. But I want to talk to you about some of your farms and how you hunt because the interesting thing about you is kind of that success that you've had throughout the whole season and how you use the timing of different parts of the season of when you'll target some of these bucks on these farms. So, Mark, to give us a little bit of background, talk to us a little bit about your background when it comes to whitetail hunting in South Carolina and also just your daily, operation when it comes to your thought process of hunting South Carolina and how you prep these farms to be able to hunt them very effectively come this season.
Well, that's a lot to dive into. How I got, as far as my background hunting in South Carolina, this is really all I've hunted. Even though, I live in Savannah, Georgia. Savannah's right there on the border, Georgia, South Carolina. I grew up in a hunting club for pretty much kindergarten through way out of college. In low country South Carolina, Jasper County. So I grew up hunting swamps, pine plantations, and properties that had that mix of a tree farm, pine farm, and wetlands, bottomlands, swamps, everything like that. So my fascination and just love for that, for the swamps, came at an early age. And as far as working our farm up here, we've had this since 2006. So it's been a long time coming, a long, slow kind of build. We basically kind of took it slow over time just because this was the first property that we were working. But really, once we really got into the forestry work, cutting trees, working the land, that's when things really started to click with me as far as how to hunt the deer better.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, it's not just you're out there during deer season, you're out there doing stuff at all times of the year in order to prep for, better habitat, not just for deer, but turkey and quail and everything else as well. So, real quick, I want to talk a little bit more about your background, kind of growing up in whitetail hunting. So your background's very similar to a lot of our other listeners. Kind of grew up, hunting clubs and those leases and stuff like that, and especially your area of the country, dealing with a lot of pines and kind of some of those swamps and everything. That's extremely relatable to a lot of our audience. What lessons did you learn early on? And maybe especially when you get to high school and college and everything, was there any like valuable lessons that you learned as a young whitetail hunter that's kind of transitioned to what you do now? Anything that was extremely impactful for you that you might have learned from a mentor or anything like that, hunting those kind of areas?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is hunting, being in a hunt club. I mean, if anyone's listening that is in a hunt club now or has been, you first, it's like you're hunting the game species, but then you're also, there's an extra layer of the other members. Not that they're necessarily getting in your way, but you're trying to, you think you want to hunt in one area. And back in the day, we had like a little clipboard, a sign-in board. Nowadays, people have different apps that you can sign on, but you had an idea about where you wanted to hunt, maybe based on when or whatever. And then you get there and someone hunted that area, a day or two prior. So there's that extra level um, of doing things. Early on, I, I would say that South Carolina, you've always been able, at least my life, bait, put out corn, put out feeders. And so that can be very effective. And I think anybody listening knows someone that's killed a big giant buck on a corn pile. and they probably had no history of it. They probably couldn't say, where that buck came from, but they killed it. And it works, but it's not foolproof. And, when you're running surveys and you're really trying to hunt them, it's not, that's something I can definitely say I learned at an early age. It's like when you're trying to shift a mature buck off their pattern, off what they're going to do and want to do, they'll eat the corn, but it's not an end all be all. So, and that kind of goes into, how I develop that kind of next stage as a hunter,
Yeah, absolutely.
learning their behavior and how they move.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of funny. Like, South Carolina, it always seems, in Georgia too, like such a long history of baiting, being legal and everything. Where like Alabama up until, probably, God, what is it? It's
5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, it became where you could actually hunt over bait. For a while, they had that little, probably like 6 years.
It's got to be 100 yards away and out of line of sight. People would put it behind a hay bale or something.
Yeah,
like
just crazy stuff. But it's been interesting because, like, when you go to places like what you're talking about, where the deer over generations have, especially in high pressure clubs, especially some of those mature bucks, it seems to associate that bait with human presence. And again, like you said, there's always guys that are successful doing it, but there's a lot of guys that seem that don't have success hunting over those areas. It's fascinating when you go to a state like where you're from, where it's been done for so long, and I could just imagine how habitual those deer have gotten to that pressure being associated with that, to the point that maybe it can backfire to you, especially on some of those more high pressure, clubs and leases and even a private farm. But now after that kind of, I guess that transition, after college and everything, what did you kind of do when it came to hunting? I mean, were you still kind of jumping around from clubs? Did you start buying some property or leasing some property, or is that when y'all had the access to this farm or these farms that y'all have now?
Yeah, coming out of college, we were still in that hunt club, and so that land had changed a little bit. We still had our main clubhouse, but it was all leased land. So we had lost some land, got some different land, but that club was starting to dwindle a little bit as far as the members and the amount of acreage that we had to hunt. So right about that time was when we purchased this farm here.
Okay, perfect. Now, this is all plays out because with you now owning this property, it's you, I guess, family and friends that kind of hunt it. So you have a really good understanding of who's out there and how you're going about doing your management strategy compared to leasing some property, which is going to kind of play a factor a little bit in how you're able to hunt and kill bucks at different times of the season based off how the property hunts for different points of the season.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to us a little bit about how does the season in South Carolina, at least in the unit or the region that you're in, how does it set up to give listeners that aren't from South Carolina or don't live in South Carolina a better understanding of what does a typical hunting season look like from when it comes to gun hunting, pressure, and everything else?
Sure, yeah. So essentially, the state is divided into 4 quadrants. Just like you would if you just took South Carolina, you just cut it down the middle and cut it, horizontal, vertical lines. That's how it's set up. Back in the day, they had like 11 different game zones, something like that. But I don't think most states have enough manpower to enforce that through the DNR. But the lower half, so game zones 3 and 4, the season opens August 15th, and it's been August 15th all my life at least. And there's no early bow season, so you can hunt, any, legal weapon, crossbow, archery, rifle, August 15th. And then, so for the first month, given, the idea is to give the does a little bit more time with the fawns as far as, nursing, winning them off. So about September 15th, a lot of fawns are starting to lose their spots and they're becoming a little more stabilized, where if, they're, the mama doe was harvested, they'll be perfectly fine with that. And, as far as the rifle season and as far as the corn, I know that we talked about baiting a minute ago, but that does play into this, is that I know that a lot of the southern states get a bad rap for, allowing bait, allowing corn, and Georgia has opened things up, but there's a reason why they do it. And there's a reason why our season is so long. And there's a reason why we can hunt the rifle, is because we have a very, very high density in South Carolina. Always has been. That's part of the reason why the, NDA, QDMA, and the different forms in the early years was started in South Carolina because of the deer numbers. So those tactics are in play so that people can kill the deer and try to, balance the herd. But as far as how the season plays out, that first month, the way I have always noticed it, at least in my area, is bucks right now, they're in their summer pattern, obviously, on their summer schedule, very, very tight home ranges, not going too far. And sometime around mid to late August, they start to break up a little bit. And our bucks will start peeling velvet, usually that third week in August. The smaller bucks might hold them a little bit longer. And some bucks will start to break up from the bachelor groups the 1st of September. Some might stay on, but once that velvet starts to peel, that testosterone starts to flare, they start making sign and then start gearing up for the pre-rut. And then you got a whole nother level of deer behavior and deer movement.
Yeah, it's crazy to have the opportunity like y'all do of being able to still hunt kind of a summer pattern for that first week or so of season, week and a half of season, maybe even almost getting to 2 weeks, that, you can really kind of capitalize on if you have a good pattern on your bachelor groups on a property that you have access to, which to me is just fascinating. Other than like, say, South Florida, which, they'll have a couple draw hunts that will happen, in the next week or two, kind of getting into, late July, early August. You guys, I'm trying to think if there's any other whitetail opportunities that open that early, except for maybe going out west. It's an unbelievable opportunity. But the thing is, this is a question I've always had for guys that do this hunt, because I know guys that hunt South Carolina and they don't take part in that season. They'll wait until, later September, October. They want a cool front. Yeah. So how many people actually get out that you personally know, especially more than some of the casual hunters, that get out that early part of the season when it's probably 90 plus degrees and just absolutely miserable?
It's, from what I always notice, it's the diehard hunters. I mean, if someone's listening to this podcast, they're probably, and they live in South Carolina, they're going to do it. Most guys, like what you said, they're waiting for that cold front, and it's like, man, we're not going to see a cold front until maybe mid-October, but it's going to be like 2 or 3 days of like cooler temps. It's not going to be cold. So, it's, when you talk to people about this kind of weather and hunting early, like in the Midwest or Northeast, they're not going to get it. And their deer are a lot different. But down here and where y'all are, really anywhere in the deep South, it's hot. There's some years we're wearing shorts and Thanksgiving, Christmas, not all the time. It could be freezing. But my point is that deer, people get hung up on temperature, and it's the rut, and everyone reads about how the timing of the rut starts the same every year. That's what biologists keep saying. That's what the research shows. But the hunters want to wait for a good cool front. But do you think the deer out there are waiting for that? They're not. So it's hot, it's challenging, but that's another reason why I like to hunt in the mornings, because it's a little bit cooler, not quite.
Dude,
that's a rabbit hole I feel like we go.
Oh, we're going to. Listen,
okay.
Right. So when I learned about Mark, it was the success you were having. Now, I think it was on one of the South Carolina Facebook groups. Like, we weren't even friends at the time. And I saw it, you had killed, it was a really good buck, dude, early season, like early August, early part of the season, second, third week of August. And then I clicked on your profile, like on the group, and if you click on someone's profile in a group, it'll show like all the posts they've made in that group. And it was like a couple years worth of you killing these bucks super early in the season. And I'm like, I am interested. And you had mentioned, I think in the post, something about hunting in the morning. And then I think I messaged you, and this is kind of how we kind of started this, about, you catching them going back to bed in the mornings versus, a lot of guys try to hunt afternoons, and they're trying to wait for that last 15 minutes of light when that buck, hopefully for them, would show up on that corn pile or that food plot or that bean field or wherever they're going to be hunting at that time of the season. Because, most of your oaks, there's not going to be really dropping at that time, maybe unless you had some soft mass. And I found that super, super interesting because, again, if you go back to traditional outdoor, whitetail media from the Midwest, nobody talks about hunting mornings until late October. Everybody's like, you stay out, you hunt afternoons, you don't hunt mornings because you can blow deer out. And the more and more successful guys that we've interviewed, specifically hunting early season specifically as well, hunting in areas with a lot of pines, have had a lot more success, especially hunting feed trees or some kind of designated food source or catching them coming back to bed, specifically in the mornings, which I find very, very fascinating. So talk to me a little bit about this. How have you developed your strategy for hunting mornings? Like, when did it really start clicking for you? And do you kind of remember the progression of what got you to start hunting mornings, and then when you started having success and started having repeatable success hunting mornings early season?
Yeah, I can tell you when I started. I have to think about that. I've always been one of those guys where it's like I hunt when I can. I mean, and that's a whole other rabbit hole talking about different weather and moon phases and all that stuff. But I just hunt when I can. You don't know unless you go, kind of thing. But I can tell you when it really started to click for me. I had already killed a couple bucks in the morning, early season mornings. But in 2019, I killed 2 bucks within like 2 minutes or so, all in one bachelor group, and that's when it really clicked for me. And you know how like sometimes like you'll have, whether you're hunting public land or private land, you'll have a plan. You're gonna hunt here. You're gonna hunt here because of these conditions. Well, you get there and you realize there's something else. The wind's different. The wind on the highway is doing one thing. The wind down here is doing something else. Or there's another hunter or a deer busted you or whatever it is. And then you shift and go somewhere else. And then you start to then you see something new. So that trip in 2019, that's pretty wild. I have to have this because like my wife had given birth to our second kid. It was my son a couple days. Yeah. So he was born August 14th. It's a good thing I can remember that on the fly because our season opens the 15th. Well, he's in a hunting now, which is great because he wants to come up here this season and have a second birthday party up here in the deer stand. But anyways, I mentioned that because my wife had just given birth, second kid. My mother-in-law came in to stay with us. And so I got the go ahead to come up here for a couple of days to hunt. And so I had a plan to go back in the timber, climb somewhere. But I tell you that early season, one of the big challenges is like the wind. Y'all know this being in the South, and I'm sure I've covered it, but like it sometimes when the wind's not blowing good, if it's like calm or like less than a couple miles per hour, it's going to do whatever it's going to do. So I climbed somewhere, deer were busting me left and right. My scent was just going everywhere. So I said, you know what, I'm going to back off. I'm going to sit on a peanut field. That was like a backup place. And it was 2 fields kind of together, but you couldn't see both of them. And I was sitting on one field. I already had a stand set up. I thought it was a good sight. And all I had was like a little doe and a spike. And I was just blown away while there weren't more deer coming in to the point where I got down a little bit early, a little bit early so I could go look at that peanut field next to me. And sure enough, I crept up and there was at least like 6 deer out there. I could see their antlers. They kind of assuming they were all bucks. It was real gray light, but I could see some antlers. And so based on that, I backed out so I didn't blow them out. But based on the field they were in and the side of the field they were on, process of elimination, I could rule out 3 sides where I know they didn't come from. They didn't cross my field. They probably didn't cross the highway during that daylight hour. So I kind of assumed where they came from. So the next morning, that's when I was like, okay. I mean, it was one of those nights where like I'm staring at our big Huntera map with a whiskey, just like saying like, because that next morning was my last morning to hunt on that trip. I had to go back and, it's diaper duty and all that. So I was like, I saw those bucks. I know what side of the field they entered. So I was like, I know with, that this is where they have to be coming from. So then that next morning went down there, climbed right outside this pine thicket. And sure enough, had some does kind of coming through, which I always notice that does tend to, this is just my opinion and my take. Does tend to be the first ones in and the first ones back when it comes to leaving bedding, going in the fields, going out and feeding the day, and the kind of first ones to skirt back, and those bucks will linger a little bit. And about 30 minutes after light, I started to have some bucks coming back through the timber, and I was climbing in some mature pines, about 25 years old, that had been thinned twice, was being burned every 3 years. So good open basal area, but then some very good vegetation height, early successional growth. And they were just browsing their way back in before they hit that pine thicket. And, I saw a nice one shot. And then all of a sudden there were more that were coming out. And it was just like, I was blown away by what I was witnessing. There was more bucks coming. And so at that point, it's like, I shot, the deer vanished. I figured it dropped, it didn't run off, but I'm sitting there thinking, I just had a second kid right at the start of deer season. 20 feet up a pine tree. My 7 mag still loaded. There's another buck. I think I need to shoot. I think so. That was the second one I shot. And that hunt, that's when it really started to click. You get these trail camera footage or film pictures of these bucks around these fields. And then you can kind of see them sometimes. They'll bed down, and deer, they'll leave their daytime bedding, and then they'll go feed, and they'll bed throughout the night and then relocate in the morning. And since then, I've been having that strategy on early season bucks.
It's fascinating. So one thing I want you to clarify, because there's a lot of listeners that hear you shot 2 bucks in one morning, and I had a situation last year where that happened, which is illegal in Alabama. It was a complete mistake on a situation. But talk to us. How many tags y'all get in South Carolina, and what is like the daily bag limit, if there is a daily bag limit on bucks?
So the daily limit is 2. And I'm trying to think when the buck tag. So doe tags, antlerless deer tags have been a thing in South Carolina since I think sometime in the 80s. Always had those, but they started the buck tags I think in 2018. Yeah, that's right, because I did tag those 2 bucks. It was either 18 or 19 is when they finally implemented antler restrictions and buck tags. However, they have a deer quota program in South Carolina that landowners or hunt clubs can apply for. And you give them a map, and they look at your county, your timber to ag or field ratio, and basically give you tags to only use for that particular property. And that's based on your area density and really how many deer they want you to shoot, if at all possible.
Interesting. Okay, fascinating.
So if we get X amount of buck tags, I would not do this, but I think legally you could fill all those buck tags immediately if you wanted to. I mean, no one would do that, obviously, but there's a little bit different rules and regs for the deer quota program.
Gotcha. Fascinating. So also, one other thing to add some, I guess some background for the listeners to understand like your properties. Give us a little idea on the habitat and the terrain. How flat or hilly or mountainous is this area? Which I kind of already know we're going to go with this. And then also, what is like the habitat makeup of your properties?
For the most part, like what people think, it's flat. Although we do have some elevation changes, about anywhere from 10 to 20 feet. We've got a couple Carolina bays. A lot of people call those different. Those have a couple different names, but essentially it's a large oval depression, and you see them throughout the Southeast. The general consensus is that they're something large hit the earth a long time ago, a meteor, something, with the way they're angled, and also some minerals and different things they have found in these depressions. So, but that big Carolina Bay, we've got a couple of them. We've got really, it's our property is just one big tree farm. We've got a lot of hardwoods, but the hardwoods around field edges, down the swamp. We have some spring-fed creeks. The swamp, for instance, has a good 15 to 20 foot drop off going down on both sides, which is great on one hand. On the other hand, it's really difficult, challenging trying to hunt. And we do have a lot of agriculture, a couple hundred acres of, leased ag fields that are in crop rotation.
Got you. Okay, fascinating. Now, I want to kind of get back, and Andrew, jump in if you have any questions, but I have a ton, because we're going to talk about the timing. So for listeners and viewers, we're kind of starting with this early season strategy, and then I want to kind of transition, because another thing that I didn't realize until I talked to you earlier on the phone is the timing of your rut, which we're going to get to, which kind of blew me away. It wasn't when you told me it was. That's not what I was thinking, at least. Which again,
I definitely want to talk about the hot temperatures and hunting in the hot Is that the direction you're going right now?
Yeah.
Okay.
I want to do more on the early season and kind of like dealing with that.
Yeah.
So with the hot temperatures, I'm going to take Andrew's question a little bit. Talk to me about your thought process again, hunting the mornings versus the evenings when it comes to the temperature swings. Like how much of that plays a factor when it comes to overall deer movement and be able to get in some areas and maybe having maybe a slightly longer window of time of movement compared to say an afternoon hunt when it's 95 degrees.
So my take on afternoons is one of the biggest challenges right off the bat is that early season, we've already covered this, you're hunting bucks only. You can't shoot those until September 15th. And if you're going after mature buck that's, maybe at least 3 or 4 or 5, that already you're setting yourself up for a very challenging hunt, because whatever your herd might be, your density wise, the percentage of bucks that you're willing to pull the trigger on is a very small percentage of all the deer out there. So if you're hunting a food plot, you're hunting an ag field, or even a corn pile, a feed, or whatever it is, you're going to have probably every other deer type come out first before your target deer. A big giant buck comes out. You're going to have all these does. You're going to have young bucks. You're going to have fawns, a ton of eyes looking around. The one benefit is it's early season. The deer aren't used to you, and they haven't been educated yet. So you do have that on your side. But as soon as one of them busts you, that's why, like bow hunting, for instance, it's extremely, extremely difficult because you have so many extra deer. And that's why, I tried glassing some of our fields, how you see these cats do out in the Midwest with, glassing scopes and all that. And you can do it, but if that field's not on a highway where there's already cars passing and you can somehow kind of blend in with another feature, if you're in a field that's surrounded by timber, there's going to be a deer that's going to bust you. And then you've really screwed that field up early season. So that's one of the bigger challenges. And that's another reason why I kind of shifted more in the mornings. Because if you're going in and getting on top of bedding, you might bump some deer that are kind of halfway there or not. But if the bulk of deer are still out feeding, when you're walking in, they're not around. And I bump and educate, in my opinion, less deer in the mornings than I do in the afternoons.
That's
interesting.
And
then that's at least my take on it.
I've actually had similar thoughts in the past, like in the evenings, especially early season. I think we might have talked about this on an outro recently, but we'll be on a feed tree or something, and when it gets dark, if I haven't seen a deer yet, I cannot get on the ground and get out fast enough because I'm like, they're going to be here any minute. And now I'm not hunting anymore. It's dark. I got to get the heck out of here. And it's not like that in the mornings. And I almost feel like you're saying, evenings are a higher impact hunt for us in our areas. And one thing I wanted to ask you about was you keep bringing up, deer behavior, and you're like a student of deer behavior, and you study that on your property a lot. I'm curious about what you see deer doing in this, 90-degree heat in early season. And the reason I ask is because we've hunted in Georgia a little bit early season where you got 80, 90-degree days, and sometimes it seems like they don't really care about it. I mean, we've seen them up in the middle of the day walking around.
Mm-hmm.
They're not just, walking through a wide open field. They're in their kind of core areas, but they do get up and move around. So what has been your experience on how the heat affects the deer, especially when they're still in that really thin summer coat?
Honestly, I don't think the heat affects them at all. I think that what changes them is the human pressure. So, I mean, if anyone's out in like a rural area that's, farmland, you can probably drive out right now. I mean, it's, right now and see deer sitting out in the sun, feeding away, sun beating down on them 90 degrees, and they don't care. And, you see photos and videos like that all the time. Now, that's not every deer doing it. But I've got videos on my Instagram account of big giant bucks that are moving around the swamps. Now they're not leaving the swamp, I don't think, but they're moving around 90-degree weather. So, and if you look at a lot of the GPS collar data, they move more throughout the day as opposed to just sitting tight. But deer, man, they're pretty much left alone for the most part. I mean, all the other predators are still there, but the main predator is gone for, 8-10 months out of the year. And That's why I brought that up a minute ago about southern deer and this, like the Midwest hunters, Northeast can't relate to this, but our deer down here, man. I mean, it's like when I mentioned about the rut and how some hunters want to wait till like some like cooler temps. The deer aren't waiting. I mean, you know, they are pretty much on the same schedule every year that happens due to photo period, and they don't it doesn't bother them. And I tell you, and one last thing, when I tell you it doesn't bother them, and it's crazy, but how deer they don't have to eat, but to maintain a healthy weight, they need to eat like 6 to 8% of their body weight a day, which is just insane to think about. If you really think on how much weight, how many pounds they got to eat every day. So like, yeah, they have to go out in the sun. I mean, they can't do all that in the night every night. They got to get out there.
Yeah, and real quick, and Andrew's got talking about that, like how much body weight, like a 200-pound deer. You're talking about 12 to 18 pounds of food. Our buddy Alan Summerford, who's been on the podcast a few times, he came down to our family farm, and he was like, "Hey, if I gave you a bucket right now, we had a couple of different soybean plots down there, and but there's a ton of like native legumes and stuff growing all over the place." And he's like, "Man, if I gave," and the soybeans at the time were real short. I mean, they were 4 inches tall, maybe. He's like, "If I gave you a 5-gallon bucket," and he said the same thing you just mentioned about how much they have to eat per day per deer based off their body weight. And I asked you to fill up this bucket, which would not be that heavy, okay? Whether it's the soybean plot or the native forage that you have on the place, how quickly do you think you could fill up that bucket, whether you're in the soybean plot or in the native forage? And like when we were looking at the ground, I was like, yeah, I can see bare soil all over the place in this food plot.
You have to walk all over the food plot.
Yeah, and the deer weren't hitting it all that much because there's all these native legumes in there and all these different browse species that they were hitting. And like, yeah, I could fill up one so much easier in that habitat than on that little food plot. But yeah, it's amazing when you start thinking about that, like how much they have to eat, on a daily basis. Especially you're talking about a deer, but still, at this time of the year in August, they're not really putting on, any more antler. They're just it's starting to harden up and they're kind of like filling out. But you're talking about, you're talking about, March and they start growing, or or April and May and June, July. They're eating so much just to build their body weight back up and then also build up that antler mass. They're burning through so many calories. I mean, it's amazing how much food they go through. And it's a really good point that I'm glad you brought up. But Andrew's got some questions on that.
So one thing I wanted to go into with the heat thing, it's an interesting subject to me because they live in it, kind of like you're saying. They're used to it. They're made to live in these temperatures. Our little southern deer, weighing 150 pounds, like they're made to live in these really hot temperatures. And is it one thing that leads into, is there anything in early season that gets you really excited weather-wise? Like if you see instead of it being 95 degrees, it's 87 degrees, are you like, all right, like we got a temp drop coming? or does it really not matter?
I know I get excited by that. That's for sure. Uh, I haven't noticed a difference because I only hunt so many times, in August, early September. So, and it's not often a little bit. Last August when I was up here hunting, it was a slightly cooler. It was like in the mid 80s. I haven't noticed a difference. I mean, I would think there is, and that's one of the reasons why I like that style of hunting. But I haven't experienced cooler temperatures early season enough to, I think, accurately answer it.
Well, what about any other weather conditions? Like maybe you got an overcast day, or maybe you got rain showers coming through. Do any of those weather phenomena like play into your tactics?
Rain. I tell you one thing I noticed 2 years ago when I was hunting is we had a downpour. It was like first light was coming. I was up a tree, and it was slowly getting lighter and lighter, kind of gray light, and all of a sudden it was getting darker and darker and darker. It was like someone was just dimming the lights back, and it was this band of rain that came in as downpour. And so the deer, I did have a bachelor group that came in, but they were a little bit too far to shoot. But they were delayed from that rain. They were in a peanut field on my neighbor's property, I assume at least. That's what I was assuming they were coming from. I was up against the bedding, and that rain, that downpour delayed them heavily, to the point where I was ready to get down It might have been like an extra hour. So I was ready to get down, but I was just baffled why I didn't see any deer. And then about 30 minutes after the rain stopped, they started to all come back, some does, and then in that group of bucks. I don't know if they just kind of hunkered down. I mean, it was a pretty good downpour, but that buck I shot last year behind me in August, there was rain that morning, but it wasn't heavy. It wasn't a downpour, and a lot of times that deer, they don't care. I mean, really, yeah, who knows? But I would think they would like it.
Mm.
Getting a little shower on them, and but who knows?
Yeah, kind of cools things off. Or if the sun comes back out, it steams us like a bunch of shrimp.
That's the problem. That's the problem. It only lasts like 30 minutes, and then it gets steamy. That's for sure. Yeah.
Also, I want to talk about because I want to talk more about how you look at these different spots in your farm, as in I know, these handful of spots will be ideal for that morning hunting
Mm-hmm.
early season specifically. So we're talking early season. We're going to get a little bit more into mid-season, late season as well in this episode. But I'm thinking about this from our South Carolina listener standpoint. If they had this opportunity to be able, they have some private land, they have the opportunity to be able to do this hunt, how they can take this into advantage for them. What are you looking for, or how are you going about scouting or analyzing your properties? And I know, y'all been hunting for a while now, but when you're analyzing something like this, how are you trying to figure out where's the best ambush point? Even though you're hunting with a rifle, but you're getting back in the timber,
Mm-hmm.
how are you pinpointing exactly what they like to bed on your property, what kind of habitat they like to bed in, and where's your best ambush point to be able to put a climber in there or hang a stand in order to get a position to catch them farther or far enough off that food source that you're catching them during the light that you're talking about?
Yeah. So ideally, if someone can identify a major hub of food, whether it's food plots, ag field, but maybe and sometimes it's off my property. It's on my neighbor's property, a big peanut field, cornfield, soybeans, whatever it might be, but a very good hub where it's going to pull deer in. And from that, it's really just trying to backtrack to the closest bedding. Our bucks that are usually like 3+ years prefer to bed in pine thickets, clear cuts that have been reforested. And once the pines get up to maybe 5 to 6 years, sometimes earlier than that, basically you need some shade. The trees have to be tall enough where you get some good shade so the sun's not really beating down on them. We've got some neighbors that clear cut a handful of years ago, and they did not replant, so they just let it grow up wild. Some people let their clear cuts grow up wild. It's a different process as far as growing trees, but that's very beneficial too. So, but just because you have that, deer are going to be in it. But then it's how are they using it? Where are they using it? I prefer to kind of hone in on thickets that are, well, if I'm going for thickets like upland sites, try to find some that might be more on the southern end of those thickets. We get a lot, south winds early season before some cooler temps start to come in on the south end of those thickets. You might, depending on the landscape, have a better breeze coming in. Or if I can think of one clear cut thicket over here where there's a little bit of a depression in the middle. People talk about deer crossing, bucks crossing in fields that have a little bit of a depression. They'll go in that so they can hide a little bit better. But some of those lower points in those thickets hold more water. Rain filters through, and you have more lush early successional vegetation. And I notice a lot of bucks in some of those thickets because they have that growth, they have the shade, and they have that early successional growth to where they can get up and feed throughout the day or when they want to and lay back down, because that's what bucks do. I mean, they're not just bedding down at first light and just going to sit there until dusk. They're gonna get up a little bit. The swamps are a little bit different of a beast to tackle early season bucks in.
Okay,
For sure.
now I got to ask you this because you're talking about bucks bedding in those clear cuts, which of course we see a ton of that. We actually just found 2 big buck beds Saturday, which we talked about on an outro from a couple weeks ago, probably.
Yeah.
That were in a shady spot, probably 5-6 year old clear cut.
Yep.
They were in the SMZ where you had some deadfall, where they had unbelievable shade and cover. The ground was extremely moist. They had a little bit of
It was
elevation.
even kind of dark in there.
Yeah, it was much dimmer, like low light capability. Even there was much more low light. At 9-10 o'clock in the morning, it was like, you couldn't wear sunglasses in there. Out in more of the open stuff, you'd be blinded. But right there, it's just so dark. But in your area, do you see those bucks kind of bedded, especially around those clear cuts? Are they kind of on the edge of it, or do they kind of get back in it? It seems. How have you seen them, especially kind of early season, bed in around the clear cuts or those pond thickets?
Yeah, so I got to be honest, I haven't really seen them a whole lot, actually utilizing them, but occasionally I will bump some driving around, getting out, whatever around them, and it does seem to be some of those pine thickets. They like to be on the edge, to I guess to see out, to have a little bit of a, I don't know if they want to be on the edge kind of close to where they can see out, or maybe that's because they've got some good wind flow. I mean, you got more airflow on the edges than you would right smack in the middle. So I assume they're probably getting in there just in the deepest, nastiest parts. They're just loaded with briars. But I'm not one that really goes in and kind of hones in on specific beds. I tend to kind of find the general thickets, that could be 1 acre, half an acre, or it could be 10 acres. But I know they're in there doing it, and then I try to pinpoint where exactly they're going to be funneling out of.
All right, so another thing I want to ask you, from one southerner to another southerner, you hear a lot of guys in the Midwest, and you hear some guys in the South talking about bucks not wanting to go through thick cover in velvet. Okay, and I have seen, in my opinion, not that to be the case. What is your take on bucks going through, whether it's high stem count areas with a ton of saplings, whether it's greenbrier, thorns? What is your take on bucks utilizing or not utilizing areas that have that extremely thick cover in velvet?
So I got to ask, who said this?
There's quite a few people. You can listen. There's some podcasts on here actually.
Yeah.
I haven't. I've actually never heard that, and I haven't noticed that. I mean, think about all those acorn tip tines that we see. I mean, those are any kind of funky, not all of them, but when you see those acorn tips and different things, those are damaged velvet. I get what they're saying, and there's some validity, because they do have nerve endings and all those little hairs. I mean, that's what the point of all the little hair on the velvet's for. But at the same time, man, that when you bump a deer or when you see a deer flee, they are skilled. And they can run like better than any other animal, but still, they're gonna be ripping through some stuff. I don't see that being the case. What I see is these deer, they just close their eyes and just bury right in. So, because it's not to go off on different habitat predator tangent, but we have a lot of predators around here. I get coyotes all the time. I hear them all the time. They're here. They're all throughout South Carolina. Most people have them. You shoot them, they're still going to come around. But coyotes typically hunt roads. I mean, that's really one of the main other predators besides a car for a deer. But a coyote's not going into briar thick. I mean, pretty much like if you don't want to go through a thicket, if you're getting ripped up, there's really no other predator that is going to subject themselves to that. I mean, quite frankly, when I'm going out hunting some of these areas and I'm wearing jeans or whatever kind of briar pant, I'm getting ripped up and just wondering, how are these fawns just doing it? But the fawns do it. They all do it.
Okay, interesting. That's kind of what I figured you were going to say. You got a grin when Jacob was asking that question. One question I have is when you're trying to narrow down, like maybe which thicket is going to be holding the bucks, or which one you ought to be targeting, like which bedding area you should hunt the edge of, trying to catch deer coming back to it. Are you utilizing trail cameras for that, or is it sign reading? Like, are you looking for big tracks or observation sets? Like, what is your process?
Really all the above, and just historical data. But yeah, I mean, tracks. I mean, fresh tracks. I mean, I, I tell people all the time. I mean, just keep a disc harrow hooked up your tractor, and I mean, that's how I turkey hunt a lot. It's just creating fire, like maintaining fire breaks. Fire breaks are a big thing down the south. Everyone doesn't do it, but even if you don't burn, I understand you don't want to disc your road. But if you have a good wide road, or the next time you or the landowners cutting trees, have them cut trees on both sides of the road, so that you open it up, get some sunlight, so you don't have to worry about ruts and mud and stuff like that. It can help dry the roads out. But keep your roads. You know, I like the grass on the roads, but also love seeing tracks. And you can't see tracks. It's amazing. You go to a property, and if there's not bare dirt, you won't see tracks. You might assume there's just not a whole lot of deer, not a whole lot of turkeys. But if you keep those roads clean, or not clean, but if you keep them kind of dist, you'll be able to see tracks. As far as other sign early season, I mean, there's really nothing else I'm looking for besides tracks. Some trail cameras, historical data, and just really kind of trying to hone in on those hubs. Food plots, ag fields, maybe it's persimmon trees, anything like that. If someone doesn't have those features, doesn't have those destination food sources, I would just suggest hanging cameras, finding some good trails going in and out, hang a camera, and then based on what you find, decide to push back, or to decide to go further in.
With tracks specifically, what gets you excited about tracks? Like, what do you need to see on the ground? Is it just a really big track, or is it the quantity of tracks? And also, what is a big track for you in South Carolina, out of curiosity?
I've heard people talk about like the four fingers or whatever, and I just a big track is just a big track. I don't I don't. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of some ones that'll. Yeah, I mean, I just a big solid buck track, and I only need one. I mean, because if you see one, I mean, really, if you any size buck track, if you see one, odds are there's some others kind of close by. Because sometimes I'll see on camera or hunting a bachelor group that just might be two. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've had a two-party like tag team bachelor group, and they're going to stick together all summer, sometimes all the way into like mid-September. And other times these bachelor groups can be 8 to 10, 12 bucks. It's kind of, I don't know if there's any kind of research on that, but just the composition, just the makeup of that process.
Okay, with bachelor groups, I'm real curious to get your take on this, because again, you have so much experience hunting when they're still in bachelor groups, and also the trail cam data too. Do you see certain age range bucks sticking together? Like as in like some of your upper, older bucks that you have on the farm, are they kind of sticking together, or do you have like some of these bigger groups where you'll have, bucks that are a year and a half old all the way up to, 6 years old or something like that in a group? How do you see like an age range structure? Is there any kind of pattern in that, as in, some bucks hanging out with other bucks, or is it kind of a mix of all different age classes?
The larger bachelor groups that I'll see, that are 6+, you'll see a whole range. Like when I killed those two bucks in 2019, there were spikes, there were 4 points, there were some even after I pulled the trigger the second time, there were some other bucks kind of still trickling in off in the distance that I couldn't really quite see well. But when they're smaller numbers, like 2 or 3, they seem to be pretty close in age, to where if they're off in age, it might only be a year or so. I don't think I've ever seen like a 1 or 2-year-old with like a 4 or 5-year-old. Usually it's like maybe a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old, or maybe, this is all just me guessing. I mean, I'm pretty good about 1 and 2 and 3-year-olds, but when it starts to get to, 4 and 5+, it's like, it can be pretty deceiving until you kill them and have that jawbone in your hand. So that's what I've noticed.
Yeah, absolutely. God, dude, I've got so many other questions with the early season, but I kind of want to get to after the early season. What else about early season I guess gets you excited when it comes to those morning hunts specifically? I mean, is there anything that we've kind of missed or like important aspects of things that you do when it comes to stand placement, picking a tree that you're going to climb or anything else when it comes to access, getting into those spots where, you get in clean where you're not bumping deer before you get in there? Like, what is some of your thoughts on all that?
That some of that stuff is really kind of I do it throughout the season. It's just, I mean, I think early season is a complete different animal because you will more than likely be the first hunter, the first human that's going to be in the whitetail woods wherever you hunt, around the hunting times. Meaning, you know, I personally think it's good if some hunting ground has some pressure of some sort. You know, whether it's just your truck driving ever so often, so that eventually over time, when you're driving a truck, you're not bumping deer. They get used to it. There's a truck coming. That's not danger. So what I'm saying is, like, yeah, you might have farmers, foresters. You might be doing work on your food plots, your deer stands, trimming roads, this and that. But probably no one's probably doing work like that at the crepuscular hours, dawn and dusk, when you should be hunting. So all of a sudden you're going out there. So yeah, I think about how I'm going to get my area. Am I going to drive? Am I going to walk? I even think about, like, if I walk, where's my scent going? Because if I'm walking a couple hundred yards down the road, my scent's blowing the entire time because I'm fully exposed. Where, as opposed to, there's times where I'll drive my truck. This is just me being way overthinking things. But if I'm sealed up in my truck, I'm not exposed. So my scent is not blowing out through the woods as I'm walking down, as opposed to driving. But I think it's being very, very methodical and very deliberate about access, getting in and getting out. Leaving the mornings, I don't think, is as important as opposed to like leaving in the afternoons. Man, that's killer. I mean, there's some times I might have someone hunting up here and they've got like a field full of does during doe season. And, they're going to try to sneak out, like, oh, it's great. I had a field full of does. I was like, I'd almost rather them shoot a doe just to kind of spook everything off, rather than the person get down and a human all of a sudden present themselves by the deer stand and all 10 of those deer see them. I would almost rather he, shoot one, but it's just being methodical and deliberate, because y'all know this. It's like you're hunting an area for the first time. There's going to be a lot of deer. They're going to be bedded all around. That all of a sudden you start hunting, and then they'll kind of push back a little bit more, back where they used to bed, and all that'll shift as the season progresses.
Great segue, because this is now I want to kind of get into this September time period. After the velvet comes off, these bachelor groups start kind of splitting up. Well, actually, even before September, talk to me about the timings of the year. We've already talked about early season, this August kind of opener, and kind of like the special thing that South Carolina has as opportunities to hunt. But talk to me a little bit about when you look at the timing of the year on your properties. Your two farms, or it's one farm, but I think it's broken into two different parcels. When you look at all the deer you've killed, do they kind of fall into certain kind of categories of the season, typically, of like when you've kind of taken some of those bucks, whether it's kind of the early season, maybe pre-rut, late season? How is it kind of broken out? And then what are your kind of like your high spots that you really like to kind of focus on throughout the season?
Yeah, you're spot on with that. Which, most of my bucks, there's some outliers, but most of them are in probably 3 different time frames. We've already talked about, early season. Well, let's just kind of fast forward. All of a sudden, it's, mid-September. I use that as an example because September 15th, we can start shooting does. Once that date occurs, we can shoot either sex all the way up to January 1st. So by the time mid-September comes around, you can still have some bucks that are going to come out on the field, and we see them and shoot them, but it's not as common. It's like, bucks are going through that kind of pre-rut stages. They're starting to kind of break up bachelor groups, or sparring a little bit, figuring out who's a dominant buck, making sign, doing whatever they do, but they don't show themselves as much from what I've seen, even in areas where we're not really hunting them, because they're going through some changes as far as their mindset. But we start really hammering the does in September. We've gone through a lot of different strategies as far as antlerless deer management, we've done it all. We've gone through years where we don't shoot does on food plots, don't shoot does on green fields. I actually got that from a manager in Alabama. I did some hunting for probably close to 10 years during the rut on the Tom Bigby River out right around Butler, York, Alabama. Awesome place to hunt. Yep. And they were, they were doing something where you don't, shoot does on green fields, and it really worked for them. For us, it made it more difficult to shoot them. We try to shoot them at the end of the season, and it never works out how you do. So I've been doing something where I just have some fun and do like a little doe invitational tournament here at the farm, invite some friends, family. It's just kind of like, a fun weekend, but really hammer them. So, I'll hunt early season with whoever in August, but it's really maybe a weekend. It might be a week. And then we back off for 30 plus days, and then we just go after the does hard, starting usually that third week in September, whenever we can kind of get a group together, try to take as many as we can. And that point, with doing it that strategy, it's very common to have doubles. I call them doubles. It's, shooting 2 does at one time, triples even. I even had a friend shoot 4 on one bean field one evening, and he still had deer coming out. But I have a rule that if you can see the deer drop, you can shoot again. But as soon as that deer that you shot runs off, either go find it or stop shooting, because last thing you want to have is 2, blood trails crossing. And I was very much worried about how that would affect our rut, but after doing it for a number of years, it does not affect the rut whatsoever. As far as the bucks don't run off. Bucks are doing their own thing. We have a very high density, so shooting those does probably helps out. And long stories that we were going through some phases years ago where we weren't shooting enough does. We were buck hunting. We had these bucks on camera, but we weren't getting them on the wall. And I was just really kind of frustrated with, we were growing these bucks from, young age all the way. And then they're dying or getting hit by a car. Another hunter was shooting them. So we were trying that strategy. Come October, we really try to lay off the does a little bit. Someone wants to go shoot one, and that's fine. But we start to kind of really focus more on bucks. That second week in October is when things really start to pick up. I've killed some good bucks October 1st, but the first 2 weeks of October, they're starting to show themselves more, made their presence known. They're probably checking scrapes. At that point, the does start to get a little, they go through their first shift, because you have all these young bucks, the spikes, the 4 points, the 1-year-olds, maybe some 2-year-olds, and they don't really know what's going on, but they start bumping the does. They start chasing them. I'm sure every hunter's seen that before the rut. You get these bucks and they're bumping these does off. So all of a sudden, you got these does that, they've got fawns, they got doe groups, and they're being harassed. So our peak breeding, and I can say this officially, I joke, and everyone's, I used to think I knew my peak breeding before I actually got a hold of a fetus scale. And, with a fetus scale, that is probably the ultimate tool someone can use. And by using that, if you harvest a doe after they've been bred, in our area, it's December, and they have fetuses, there's a scale. It's really a ruler that Joe Hamilton, the founder of QDMA, created, and you measure it, and they have the dates on there. And so basically, you're measuring how long it is, and then it tells you when that doe was bred, when that fetus was conceived. If there's twins, triplets, you just average it together, and it really only takes like maybe five or six does late season, and then after a while, all the dates just start coming in. This is the peak breeding when the first hitting estrus. Later on, you see, our season isn't long enough. If you were to shoot one the very end of December, 1st of January, you might see a fetus from that second rut cycle. But that around the 20th of October, if you're in an area in a thicket where does are, that smell of estrus, where if you get, deer estrus, if you buy deer urine in the store, that smell should hit you out in the, thickets walking around. And that's when everything kind of opens up wide here.
Dude, that's so crazy. Again, when we originally, you and me talked earlier today about the rut, I was thinking sometime in November because I knew the season doesn't last very long. I mean, even though it comes in early, it ends. I think it's like, is it ends the end of December typically, or first January?
January 1st.
Okay, January 1st. So
Yeah.
it's not like us. We go to February 10th here.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking like November. You're like, no, dude, it's like the second, third week of October. It's like it's it. Like that's when does are getting
Yeah.
bred. It's just, which is kind of cool. Yeah, that's just really fascinating to be honest. But that is super interesting how you started using that the fetus scale or that ruler system in order to kind of on your property figure out, like after you average up 6-7 does and those fetuses, what the average is for peak breeding in that place, which really you can use that so much into your advantages. I don't care about necessarily hunting that day, but that week leading up to it, that 10 days leading up to it, and maybe even like the latter 6 or 7 days trying to find those last couple does to come into heat. I mean, that is so valuable in order to kind of have that information on property. And again, I haven't heard of a landowner necessarily doing that on their own. So that's super fascinating. Now, in addition to that, the transition in October, how does your hunting style transition in October when you're trying to get these bucks kind of early pre-rut, that pre-rut happening that first week of October as they're transitioning to find those first hot does, that second, third week of October?
Yeah. So if I'm trying to kill a buck, right when the rut's kicking off, I might, if we have a good field that's just red hot, some fields kind of come and go as far as preference. I think it's, of course that deer have their nutritional preference, but it's also hunting pressure. I mean, some spots get burned, but if we have a good red hot field, I'll hunt it. But if not, I like to hunt around the does. I like to find, and usually where does are that time of year is where they're most years are going to be, but really try to find where they are, find where they're bedding, find where they're feeding, look for tracks, look for their droppings, the tracks, especially if you smell that estrus on the ground, and then just hunt around that, because that's when I will hunt around where bucks are early season and late season, but right there in the middle, I'm hunting where the does are, because, why am I trying to chase down where he's bedding or whatever? Because they're going to be after. It's like, I use this analogy all the time. If someone's ever been around a dog that's not fixed, not neutered, a male dog, and if they're ever around a female dog that's in heat, especially when that dog is receptive, because the female takes a little bit for them to become receptive, but that male dog, I mean, that is all he's wired to do. And that's what bucks are wired to do. And that's how the species has survived for millions of years. So I find the does, and that's where I hunt them. It just kind of depends on where they are. That the only major tactics I'll employ would be using a doe decoy. That part of October, I have rattled my entire life. And it wasn't until a couple of years ago, I think I really fine-tuned at least our area, that I don't know what it is, but that first week in November, it's, rattling for me has been highly successful. But calling is a whole different mindset, because you got to be in the earshot of the buck. The buck has to hear it, but then they also have to be jacked up. They have to be in that mindset where either they're angry and they maybe want to fight, or they're just curious. So just because you grunt or you rattle doesn't mean you're going to pull them all in. But using that decoy, I've had this decoy for a long time, and it came with antlers. And I first started hunting it, using a small buck. And after a while, I just, after I was learning more about deer behavior and deer biology, it's like, okay, so if I've got a small buck that resembles maybe a small 2-year-old, that means that I'm hoping that a 3+ year buck is going to see it and it's going to anger them. and they're going to trot in to look at get a better look or try to fight it. So again, it's kind of like rattling. It's like you can rattle, but it's not going to get every buck. They've got to be in that mindset, come in. So why mimic a buck as far as a decoy during the rut? Why not mimic a doe? So, I took the antlers off, and, placement has to be, you really got to think about placement about the doe decoy. And then if your state, if it's legal to use estrus scent, man, that is killer. You got the doe decoy, you got the estrus scent, and if you kind of have an idea about where deer are going to be moving through wherever you're hunting, and if you can play the wind to where you can get in early and set the decoy up with that scent to blow, where you anticipate those bucks, anticipate that deer coming through, that's a pretty deadly combination.
And would you be doing that more so with like a crosswind kind of situation or setup? How would you kind of go about having that wind blowing in a certain direction and you be able to kind of, shoot in that general area?
You're exactly right. A crosswind. Yeah, I haven't used a decoy that much, but I've been doing it off and on for a long time, since I think I got that like in 07. So yeah, like it's got to be a crosswind. You don't want it on top of you. You don't really want it. I mean, the bow hunters that do it, I commend them, but I don't really have it too close, a little bit further out. You try to do it in some areas where you're not going to startle them. You don't want a deer to all of a sudden step out and just 10 yards from them. That being said, I don't think I've ever, if I've had a doe bump off from that doe decoy, I didn't know about it. It's, they'll look at it and they don't care. At all. But yeah, a good crosswind is what you need for sure.
Typically, are you going to do that more so in a larger opening, whether it's a larger plot, a larger field, or something like that, or will that ever take place in in the timber at all?
It's primarily going to be on fields, like you said. Occasionally, depending on what the situation is, I will bring in some timber. A buck. I shot a buck last October. It was I think the 22nd or 23rd, 24th, 25th. I was up here for a weekend with some friends that third weekend in October, and there were 3 big bucks shot and more scenes. That's a good weekend to be in the woods. But in that scenario, I was up against a spring fed creek bottom that some beavers had dammed up, a little beaver pond. It's just it's a hub for finding shed antlers. You go around those areas looking for sheds, you find antlers down there. It's just a good kind of classic place for bucks to hold the as a stronghold for deer. And the wind was right, and I was hunting a pond block that gets a lot of deer to cross through. It's not very big, and I went in there with my decoy, had a good crosswind, had some scent out around the decoy, kind of drifting right down to that bottom land. And he came in with his head down, just creeping in right in there.
That is interesting, especially like the scent aspect. We get scent, like especially like deer lure scent, talking like especially estrus or buck ear and stuff like that. Some states you can use it, some states you can't. Some states it has to be synthetic. Some states allow natural scent. But it's always highly discussed on the podcast because you have some guys that truly believe in it and love it, and other guys are like they've had absolutely terrible results for like scaring bucks or just bumping deer out with like estrus. I mean,
yeah.
What is your take on some of that? Just because again, we've heard both sides on this podcast. It's almost 50-50 between the guys that like it and use it and trust it, and the guys are like, I'm not going to carry it with me at all at any point in the season.
It is tricky, like you said. I really, if I use a scent, it's going to be an estrus scent, doe urine with estrus, and it's going to be around the ruts. That last two weekends of October, first week of November. One of the big issues you can have, and it happens a good bit, is if a doe catches wind of it, they don't spook off, but it just really angers them. And it's weird, like they just know something's off. And they don't do that when they smell other real estrus out in the woods, but you can really just anger a doe group to the point where that matriarch doe just hangs around, and she might even circle around downwind to where you had that scent hanging from. to see. But that's always happened when I've had just the scent out. I've never had that experience when I've had the decoy with the scent. I don't know, maybe if they would smell it and then they also see the decoy or what. But when I've had those problems with the does and they just lock on that scent, they're just irritated and they're blowing, they're stomping. Those are usually tight areas. Those are usually tight spots, and they just know something's up, but they don't want to leave. Like they're not running off. They're just hanging around. You know that either you're going to get a shot on that doe or your hunt is probably toast.
Gotcha. Now, also, during the rut specifically, how does, like, say, especially if you're hunting a little bit more in the timber, whether you're like in some of these pine areas, in around some of these clear cuts, these little thickets, versus like the swamp, how do both of those places hunt differently, specifically during the rut? And do you lean towards one more so than the other, especially when you're in the timber?
Yeah. Well, the swamp's a lot more fun. I can tell you that. There's a lot more nasty things down there that'll bite you. The swamp's a lot is just aesthetically, I just love it. I just love being down there. However, um, so if you're on the front end of the ruts, I find you have a lot more bucks they're not moving quite as fast. Later on, that third kind of going in November, they can really you see them moving faster. You see them just kind of chasing. And when that happens, if you're down the swamp, it's a lot tighter. So it's just harder hunting. I mean, you just can't see as well. Basically, you can't see as well. And that's why I do a lot of rut hunting in the timber. When I say timber for us, it's mature pine trees, thin a couple of times, and it's still, they're big, but I can still fit my climb around it. With that, I can see so much further and I can see them a little bit better, maybe coming and going. But yeah, the swamp, it's hunting there. I do have more success during the rut and then after the rut because they're moving a little bit more consistently, coming and going. I find that bucks, they will leave the swamp, but they're not really moving as much. Before the rut, they're just feeding. They're doing their thing. They're feeding, but then during the rut, they're trying to find the does.
I got a question about the rut, especially with running trail cameras. In the earlier part of the rut, where you're saying they're like maybe they're moving more in daylight, but maybe they're moving slower as compared to the later rut where things are getting a little bit crazy. Is there a
Yeah.
particular time in the rut where the bucks that are kind of like your homers, like they're on your property, where you're more likely to kill them, like maybe in the early rut, but then later rut you're gonna have like that totally random deer come through that you're gonna get a crack at? Have you noticed anything like that, or do you just start seeing random bucks show up right off the bat and it just kind of goes off the wire immediately?
Yeah, I've never really noticed any kind of correlation with that. What I have noticed is that we'll get certain bucks on trail camera, just like everybody does during the summer and early season. And those are the bucks you get. And then some of those bucks will stick around, and you see them throughout the year, and some don't. And then sometimes on the rut, you have a buck that shows up that gets shot, or someone sees, or gets on trail camera that you haven't seen before. And I've there are some experienced hunters, and there's one even biologist that swears that that I personally know that some of the older bucks, so younger bucks, do a lot more breeding than what we being the whitetail researchers, not me, but they used to think that it was more older bucks doing most of the breeding. But with the GPS collars, what they're seeing is a lot of younger bucks are doing just as much, if not more, breeding. Some very experienced hunters will say that some of the older bucks, 4 and 5 plus, will kind of hang back. And when this first doe's going to heat, they're not going to be out chasing around. They'll wait a little bit. I haven't really noticed any kind of correlation with that. If I could tag my bucks, if I could put GPS collars on them, I could certainly figure that out. But man, when you look at some of these, like Mississippi State University, their content is just insane. But if you look at some of those GPS collar, like home ranges, they'll be tight. tight early season, tight throughout the summer, to where they're not even crossing a paved road or whatever it is. And then all of a sudden the rut kicks up and they're on this property, that. Sometimes there's really you can't predict it. Some stick and run around the property and some doesn't. So I do not subscribe to that theory that you can get all the quote bucks on your property early season on camera. Doing the surveys, I think it helps tremendously, but I don't think you can really get a handle as far as your bucks.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that too. We got our hands on some GPS data from Auburn University a couple years
Mm-hmm.
back, and we did a couple like videos on it they're still on our Patreon right now. But that's one thing that we saw, and these are collared deer that were on WMAs in Alabama. There was, I think, 2 WMAs and 3 hunting clubs that they were on, and we saw the same thing. It was actually kind of shocking, to be honest with you, how small some of the home ranges were, because there would be like a creek drainage, one creek drainage with little tiny drains coming off the sides of it, little tiny SMZs, but one main creek. And this deer, this one in particular I'm thinking of, he just ran a circuit and he like never left that. And then in the rut, I mean, he ventured out some, but still he was pretty tight, and he had a couple little spots that he would always go back to. But there was a bunch of them like that, and there was a couple of them that were kind of all over the place. But I honestly was really surprised at how small of an area they would cover. And we had this one deer that we were looking at. This was on one of the hunting clubs. There was some planted pines next to a big hardwood bottom, and this buck, it was a collared buck because it had the sex data and everything. This buck was bedded in those pines and went to that hardwood bottom like 21 days in a row or something like that. Like, I mean, like clockwork. He wasn't going to the
Yeah.
same tree every time, but probably I don't know, what did you say, 400 yard stretch of hardwood bottom. He was just going to it every single day, and I was like, golly, like that kind of opened my eyes to how habitual they can be, especially in the earlier part of the season, kind of kicking it back a little bit here. But like what you just said just kind of tipped me off to that. And I'm curious, do you have any like good examples of maybe bucks that you've had on your property that you've had like a lot of history with, that you've had to like really track and learn over the years in order to get a tag on?
Yeah. There was one, I was a buck I shot in 2015 that we had on camera for 2 years prior. And it took a little bit. And if I didn't, I mean, as far as catching up to him, I mean, it's just hunting around does. And I shot him walking into I shot him with my climber on my back, walking in to climb over a cutover. And of course, when I'm talking about it, people should not do on public land, obviously, but I do bow hunt a good bit, but I typically bow hunt in just certain setups, basically tight situations. If I'm hunting where I can see a little bit further, I'm taking a rifle. And I've gotten to the point where a while back I took my rifle sling off, and I took my rifle sling off because, it used to be people would say, if you're freehanding, shooting a rifle, which I try not to do, but if you wrap the sling around your elbow, none of that really. If you go to any kind of shooting instructor or like a sniper or anything, they're not going to tell you that doesn't do anything. So I took the sling off, and one of the reasons, because without a sling, it's not on your shoulder, and it's in your hands, and you should have 2 hands on it, which means if your pack's on your back, your climber's on the back, all you have to do is throw up and click the safety off, find it, and you're getting a shot off seconds, and those seconds are everything. So, and I've killed I can think of 2 really good bucks walking into areas. And so I like to walk in, creep in, always kind of looking around. And it was Friday the 13th, 2015, November. And I was walking in to climb over a cutover, and something just kind of caught my eye down this fire break, and there was a buck standing there just looking right at me. And it didn't move. After I shot, there was some movement right behind him. So the only thing I can figure was maybe he was with a doe or two, and that's why he just didn't really bolt. He wanted to, he was looking right at me. But that one, usually it's as far as the tactics, it's just hunting hard and just trying to really focus about where the does are going to be, or where bucks are going to be. There was one that I ended up getting right after Christmas one year, and that was he whipped my butt throughout the rut. I actually had my crosshairs on him once. I made a mistake that season. That was 2016. I made the classic mistake of this buck was coming out exactly where I wanted a buck to come from, right? This trail in the pines. And I made that classic move of using my binos instead of raising my scope up. So that cost me a shot on that buck, and ended up catching up with them feeding, because by the time mid-December comes around, there could be some straggler does or fawn does that are in heat that haven't been bred yet. But for the most part, these deer's worn down. They've been running hard. They've cut weight, and a lot of the bucks they just gravitate towards food sources.
Yeah. What you got, Andrew?
No, what you
I was gonna say that was a good transition because I kind of wanted to get into that kind of later season hunting, and again, that being another time period about potentially targeting these areas and really kind of focusing a little bit different hunting style. So how does that change for you? We kind of mentioned the rut in the success, and by the way, I'm also pro no sling on a rifle. I've been doing it the last 3 or 4 years.
Good. Yeah.
And
that cost me an opportunity last year.
The funny thing is, I gotta think here. I don't think I've shot one like that, but there's been a lot of times because I don't walk in the woods with. I mean, there's when people ask how do you get up a tree stand? How do you get up the tree with your gun if you don't have a sling? Because most guys tie their pull up to their sling. I strap it to my backpack and just climb up the tree. It's on my backpack the whole time. I hang the backpack and the gun's right there. It's super nice and easy, and I take it off. But anyways, so the other thing about your hunting style is kind of this late season opportunity, and like you just mentioned with the idea of these bucks really pushing back to feed. What about this time of the year, especially if you have a buck that you still want to go after, if you're hunting specific deer, or you have the thought process that there's probably another good buck on the property that I really want to try to go and find. What are you running through your mind and what are you going to be checking at that point of the season? I mean, is this really when food plots play a big advantage for you? Is there oaks or late dropping acorns that are really playing an advantage for you? Like, what are you trying to take in consideration that time of the year to really try to find and focus on those bucks and get opportunities at them?
Yeah, you mentioned acorns. Acorns very much play a part. With our setup, we have a lot of oaks and a lot of acorns, or if it's a good mast year, we do. But the oaks are really kind of spread out. We have some mixed in some pines, but a lot of them are on field edges, hedgerows, down the swamp, really places that not many like oak groves. Now we are creating some of those with some oaks, that we're planting, but I don't necessarily have like a good solid kind of hardwood bottom as far as open with acorns in the ground. We typically will plant some naked oats in the fall. We'll do some different kind of food plots, but naked oats, it's just a variety. Deer love them, and you can get them very, very inexpensive. I mean, sometimes $5 or $9 a bushel, very inexpensive. And deer love that early growth, which is still happening in December. By the time January, February rolls around, they'll head out, and deer won't eat them. However, it's outstanding for quail and turkeys and insects. Will just load up if you leave that oat standing all the way until the next spring when you're spraying for your spring food plots. But to really answer your question, what I'm trying to focus on is really not so much like food sources, because they're here, okay. But we've already kind of covered deer will eat them just about anything for the most part. I mean, I've seen them eat Spanish moss. They'll eat about anything. They are mowing down our cotton field right now. What I try to hone in on is really where the pressure is the least. Where I read this book that Dr. Valeris Geist, he's this famous, deer, elk biologist, had a lot of different theories, but his book called Whitetail Tracks, really awesome. One thing that stood out to me was he talked about how whitetails will sacrifice better food options for better cover. safety is first. Safety is above all. If they've got good safety, but it's right by a Walmart parking lot, that's where they're going to be, in the Walmart parking lot. They want that safety. So you got to think, man, Bucks have been running at that point of December, our late season. They've been running hard, and they've really kind of thrown themselves out there. Now, I don't think they are thinking, hey, I've been around hunters the past month, I need to scale back, but their testosterone is dropping a little bit. Once that estrus, once those come out of the heat, their testosterone starts to drop, and they kind of start to shift back in that mindset before the rut. So they're holding up in their strongholds. They're going back in the swamps, they're going back in the thickets, and they're eating a lot. And what they eat is, I think, is really from what I hone in on, is where people have not been hunting. And that's in typically late season. If you want to see some deer, just go where people haven't shot, go where people haven't hunted, go where there's no pressure, and you'll find deer. I'm not going to guarantee it's always going to be a buck, but they are. I'm trying to think the right way of saying it. They are deficient on calories, like you mentioned earlier, and I don't think they consciously think about that, but they're about to drop their antlers, and then start to regrow those. And then if you think about, I think bucks, when or deer in general, when they hit 4, their skeletal system is about complete. So up until 4 years old, not only are they eating for put the body weight on to grow more antler, but they're still growing bone. Their actual bones are still growing. So it's all about food at that point.
Now, at the end of the season, where you're seeking out these less pressured areas, when you find that less pressured area, are you then just trying to hone in on the best food source in that low pressure area, or is there something else? Like, are you just trying to hunt up next to the bedding, and it doesn't really matter exactly where the food source is as long as you know exactly where the bedding is at, or is it vice versa?
I typically will hunt around bedding or just good solid travel corridors. I mean, just kind of go into a thick area, probably some areas that are a little bit thicker than what I've described earlier, to where they could be pines, but I can't see as far, a little bit tighter, and just looking for fresh sign. Really, that point is fresh sign, meaning droppings and tracks, just kind of finding where they are, and then basing the next hunts on what I see, observational sits. I don't do that thing that Midwestern hunters will do when they, go places where they'll spend the first couple of days observing. I'm bringing a rifle or a bow, and I'm going to hunt my way in, but you see something and adjust accordingly.
Yeah.
But as far as, destination food sources, not really so much, because our acorns, if they're still on the ground, they're all over the place. And then as far as the fields are great, but at that point, deer really aren't coming out in those fields in the open. They might be slipping in, after dark, so maybe hunting around the edges.
Now, with late season, do you have a preference, morning or evening or midday, of when you potentially have more success late season? I mean, is it more of an afternoon movement? I mean, if you kind of explain some of that for us, because it's always interesting. It's always like one of the hardest times around here where we're at. When we start getting the late season, you get post rut, and it's like what you mentioned, especially, we're hunting some big pieces of public land, but there are so many guys that are out there to find those little nook and crannies that are holding those bucks and holding those deer late season.
Yeah.
It is like you went from seeing a ton of deer to they have completely disappeared.
Went in a hole in the ground.
Absolutely.
I can't say that there's a better time of day to hunt. I really don't, other than if you really want to break it down, the majority of hunters are going to be in the afternoon. I mean, I think statistically, you're going to see more people out in the woods hunting in the afternoon. So if you want to split that hair, you could say hunting in the mornings would maybe have less pressure. There's less hunters in the landscape, but really kind of goes back for me is that I just hunt when I can. I mean, I don't, I live 2 hours away from our farm. So it's really kind of based on when I could go. I was rarely looking at a count. Well, I shouldn't say. I can look at a calendar now and say, hey, I want to hunt opening week, the rut, whenever. But as far as weather, any kind of factors, I just go when I can.
Gotcha. Fascinating. Now, is there anything specific you like about late season hunting? If you still got some tags in your pocket, you're still trying to harvest a buck. I mean, is there anything you like about it? As in, like, is there any kind of consistency you're seeing with late season, or is it fairly random, as in the activity and opportunities?
I think the latter of what you said. It's you say random, but then someone say, well, there's a reason why there's always a reason deer do things. But yeah, it can be kind of random. I mean, what I like about late season hunt is shooting does, because I can pull so much. I mean, it's amazing how much data points you can collect from the skinning shed. And so, like what I mentioned earlier about that fetus scale, I tell people this all the time, even they're hunting public land. I mean, if you're hunting a general area of a state, and if you can over time, even if it's over a period of years, if you can kill a certain amount of does, 3 to 5 to 6 does late season, and collecting that data of the fetus, you've got a great piece of data for that particular area. I like that. Yeah, I would prefer to shoot a buck a little bit earlier in the season so they're not quite as depleted. It's always interesting, when you get these bucks on camera during the summer, and they've got these big bellies, and they're 190, 200, 210 pounds. And then if someone shoots that same buck in November or December, I mean, it looks like they weigh 150 pounds. They're just so much smaller. So yeah, I would rather shoot them a little bit earlier. You gotta wonder, as far as the meat quality, I can't speak on that, but I can speak early season has better fat. You get some of that better, some of that good early season fat was real good, not that hard, deer fat, but some of that good outside fat can be good. But as far as shooting does, I would rather shoot all my does early season. It doesn't always happen. Actually, it never happens because we can't. It's just we can never shoot enough does. But if you think about it, it kind of goes back to guys that want to shoot the does later in the season. It's like, I get their thinking, and some people can legitimately do it if they're in a density that's maybe, I don't know, 20 to 30 deer per square mile. But if you're in a high density area like we are in South Carolina, it's going to be extremely challenging because the number of does that you need to shoot is not obtainable. I think one of the best selling points is that, so let's say you've got 10 does in your property, and there's 10 does and you're going to kill 10 does. So if you shoot them before the rut, those mouths are off the landscape then. But if you shoot them at the very end of the season, they've been eating that entire season. So like your fall food plots, the acorns, all that stuff you're doing, you're putting money into, you've got deer that are consuming it, that you were planning and that you were going to kill anyways, as opposed to the deer that you're going to leave on the landscape. So it's just a little bit more food left out there. And of course I hear all the time about, leaving the does, not messing with them until after the rut so they can track the bucks. So we did that for a couple seasons early on. And so my comment with that would be, I would say, is that what is someone's deer per square mile? How much deer, how much deer do they have at the farm? Like, how much deer are they talking about? Because if they don't know, then that's why I used that example earlier. If you're in like a lower density area, it could be attainable. And maybe you want that. But if you're in a higher density area, like a lot of the South is, where you're way over 50 or 60 per square mile, that's not obtainable. And on top of that, you're also not going to shoot every doe. It's not possible. So, but I can attest to this. And I mentioned this earlier about how we were going through some phases around like 2018, 2019. We were getting these bucks on camera. We were watching them get these, and so all of a sudden you start to hunt these bucks. You're hunting for them. You're passing on does. Next thing you know, you've gone a year or two without killing enough does. So bucks that you want to kill, you're not going to see them, is because you've got way too many does, and there's does out any given time. There's does out in the field. There's does in thickets, and so where do you think bucks are going to go? They're going to be in those thickets, and so you're not going to see the bucks. And that's why a lot of these biologists, when they talk about you start shooting does, you will it's interesting. It's like, and I'm not going to go down that tangent, but when you take mouths off the landscape, you grow bigger antlers, you grow healthier deer. The does are healthier, the fawns are healthier, the antlers are bigger and better. When you have, some people say, I want to be able to see 20 deer in a given hunt. That's going to be a lot of does. And that's just not very healthy. So, taking them, if when you thin them out, the bucks are gonna move so much better, and you're gonna be able to see them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the first detailed conversations I had about that was with I want to say it was Matt. Is Matt Dye?
Yeah.
With Land and Legacy. Mm-hmm. He was on the podcast a couple years ago, and we had this conversation, and he really explained also, like you said, you can't kill all the does, and more than likely your neighbors are not going to be doing the exact same thing you are. And this natural dispersion or dispersal of doe groups and just does in general, they're always trying to find the next best food source. And if you kill a bunch of does on your property, especially we're talking private land hunters here, you kill a bunch of does on your property, there's still does around you. Like, you might have killed what you thought was on your property, but they're not living on just that 50 or 100 acres or a couple hundred acres. You're going to have deer naturally disperse onto that property in addition to that. So that's why it's truly, unless, everybody in the county was trying to shoot every single doe they had the opportunity of, which is highly unlikely that's ever going to happen.
I wish that would happen.
Yeah. It's not going to be a situation where you're necessarily running out of deer in these high density areas. Again, if you're in an area where it's 6 or 7 deer per square mile, that's a little bit different situation versus where you're talking about and where we're at too, where you have fairly high deer numbers, extremely high deer numbers in a lot of places, to the point that you're not making a dent. Like, you don't have enough bullets or enough arrows on a property because, it seems like, especially, and maybe you can kind of relate with this, depending, like, maybe your dad or, whoever you kind of grew up hunting with. A lot of those guys that grew up in the 60s and 70s where there wasn't a lot of deer, especially in some of these areas, especially where we're at, they had the mindset like they don't want to shoot a lot of does now because they knew back when it wasn't great, when there was not a lot of deer. And that mindset's still out there with a lot of people. And I'm sure some of our listeners are the same way, that mindset that, but there wasn't a lot of deer back then, so we're trying to conserve all the does, and we're just shooting bucks only. And, unfortunately, some of the public land that we hunt, when it comes to rifle opportunities, we have very limited rifle opportunities. They have very specific weeks and weekends that you can actually hunt during rifle season. And they only allow maybe one or two of those hunts a whole year during rifle season to actually shoot does. All the other ones is buck only. So unless you have a lot of guys out there with archery equipment killing a lot of does, which really doesn't happen when you look at deer getting checked in, it's very few and far between. You have an abundance of does, and you kind of have that situation we're running into now, like what you're talking about, that you don't see a lot of those mature bucks covering the ground as often because they have does in every little thicket. They're tied up for the whole season, when it comes to the rut. And, there are big bucks get killed. We've had opportunities, killed some of those deer. Scott Sales and some of these other guys have killed some of those bucks. But it makes it, as you're saying, more challenging when you have that many more deer out there and also that many more mouths to feed on the landscape.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, people sometimes, I think people get a little too down that road of like, oh, well, when bucks are in the rut, they're not thinking. They got blinders on. They're just going to step out on the highway. And it's like, well, they will do that, but they're still smart about it. So, I mean, if they're going to chase deer in a field or chase deer in a thicket, and an older buck that's wise and smart, he's going to be in that thicket. He's not going to go out in the field. So that plays into it. And, going back to shooting does and doe numbers, that's always good to kind of talk with your neighbors or kind of feel your neighbors out. Or if you don't want to get to know them, just pay attention to them. Pay attention to the shots you hear, them coming and going. Because a lot of people hunt, but a lot of people, they're not killing enough does, at least in my area, South Carolina. People aren't killing enough does as they should be. But it's at a certain point, it gets to be work. And it really is if you're trying to do it. But it goes back to what I was saying earlier about if someone starts talking about what they should do with those, I would say, well, what is your population? What's your density? And then from there, it's like, okay, well, what's your fall recruitment rate? And it's like, well, I don't know. It's like, well, if you're keeping QDM style records, it's not hard down the skinning shed, lactation and maintaining a hunter observational log. If you're a public land hunter, it could happen if all the public hunters would want to share what they saw, but of course that's not going to happen. But hunt clubs should do it. You got your harvest log, all the data you extract from that dead deer, and then the hunter observational, which means trying to break it down, how many does, fawns, spikes, all that, and from that you can create a fawn recruitment. And so with that, how many fawn recruitment, how many fawns are living to the hunting season. Based on that, how many deer have been replaced. So you have to shoot that same amount. So if you want to be even, of course, I forget the percentage you want to factor in for just like natural death, a death occurrence, but you've got to figure that number out if you're managing a property, but how many deer you need to kill just to maintain that average. And then if you're going to lower the population, you got to go above that. And so what we deal with up here is that a lot of people hunt the South, but every property is not hunted, even though we're in this insane, it's like east of the Mississippi is by far the most hunters in the entire country is east of the Mississippi, mostly in the South. But every property is not being hunted. And, some hunters only want to shoot a buck, maybe a doe for like freezer meat. Like my family, for instance, my household, we eat venison all the time. We probably only eat 4 or 5, a year. So killing does, people have to do something with. So and I'll tell you something else I've been noticing is ever since this, 2020, maybe y'all seeing in Alabama, but the forestry market for timber, cutting trees has really picked up. There's been a lot of kind of backlog properties that are being cut. And so with that, it's like what I'm noticing is I'm seeing all those clear cuts around here, and that in a couple of years, those clear cuts are going to be thickets, and they're just going to be strongholds for deer. And all that's doing is it's just creating more thickets, which means there's going to be more fawns surviving, and this going to increase the deer population.
And see, that's so crazy that not crazy, but it's so interesting to have this conversation because more people than not that we talk to would want to have more deer on the landscape, just from their talking to public land guys, and I think they mean more bucks on the landscape, maybe not does, but more bucks.
Of course.
But it's interesting, you're looking at a lot of this stuff and you're like, dude, this is terrible. All these cuts coming in, we're gonna have even more deer than we're already dealing with now, and we need to lower that number, not increase that number on your property. Give those bucks and also those other deer that survive a healthier opportunity in order to put on more weight, put on more mass, put on more, antler potential, all that kind of stuff. And it's hard to do that when you have, 75 other mouths to feed, on a property or in a general area. So that is a very interesting dynamic. I think this is the first time we've ever heard that on the podcast.
Yeah.
Which is great, which is awesome.
Because I don't think we talked about that with Matt on the podcast, did we? That might have been an afterward conversation.
Yeah, maybe. I can't remember.
Yeah, and like one of the telltale signs is that if you're having trouble growing a food plot, if you're having trouble keeping the deer out for the food plot, whatever it is to get established, meaning that they come in and just snip off that bean plant at a young stage where it's cached. If you're having that problem, if you're having to do tactics to keep the deer out just to get established so they can feed on it, rope system, there's different kind of, fertilizer, electric fence. If you're having to do that, you've got a lot of deer that maybe you need a better habitat, maybe you need to burn. But even then, I read something a month ago. It was so the state of South Carolina, there's an estimate of $30 million worth of damage, crop damage for soybeans alone annually in South Carolina, just soybeans. And there's cotton fields around here that are just, it looks like someone took a bush hog to it, clipped down. So it's those areas, if you're seeing, people can learn a lot from like farmers or paying attention, reading kind of that kind of stuff. If you're seeing that kind of articles and data, you're in a high density area. There's nothing wrong with that. It's actually great hunting. But if you're really trying to grow that next level of buck, and with the antlers and that health, you've really got to dial in on the herd.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, awesome, Mark. I'll say this. I think we're gonna have to you back on, maybe talk a little more details about some of this. And actually, what I thought about get him and get Mark and Alan on
Oh, that'd be interesting.
That because
That'd be
I
really
think there'd be a lot
interesting.
of like interesting connections
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
Mark, I appreciate you joining the podcast.
Yeah,
Real,
man.
real quick,
Glad to be here.
you've got your own podcast as well. If people want to listen to you and kind of get some more of your thoughts on stuff and some of the interviews that you've done on your podcast, how can guys find your podcast? Give us the name of the podcast, and also how can guys follow along with you on social media as well in case they want to maybe ask you individual questions.
Yeah, so people can find me. I'm on Instagram. It's at Mark Haslam, MarkHaslam. And then I started Southeast Whitetail. I guess I was just bored during COVID. It was just being home. And, I tell you what it was is just my Instagram, if you go scroll all the way back, just like everybody else, it was like, dog photos and just, like concert photos. And then all of a sudden I started to kind of showcase more about what I do here at the farm, hunting stuff and management stuff and all that. And so that the Instagram was kind of my outlet. And then I wanted to just really kind of show more, mainly because of, there's not many outlets like yourself. There's not that much media content. Most of the quote hunting content that everyone goes to does not apply to the South. So I started southeastwhitetail.com. It's a website, write some articles for, and that morphed into my wife bought this microphone for me because I was doing some guest spots on some podcast. And then I was like, I'm just going to try it. And I recorded one and I liked it. I like to talk about this if someone can't tell. So that's what it is. So it's Southeast, it's at southeast.whitetail because I went through a bunch of names I wanted to do, and there's like 5 different Southeast whitetails and different reincarnations, but they're all like defunct. There's like Instagram accounts where like they haven't been touched in like 5-10 years. So it's southeast.whitetail, and that's how people can find me.
Awesome.
I mostly focus on my three focal points: habitat, conservation, venison. So really just, better than land, conservation, and then, venison, wild game.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, Mark, we greatly appreciate you. Listeners, if you've enjoyed this video, again, video podcast, this is on YouTube, always write in, but also if you've enjoyed listening to it, make sure you share this with a buddy. Again, we love having guys on like Mark that are willing to share some knowledge, share some experience. And, one thing we could ask from you guys is to share the show with your buddies. It just helps out tremendously with the show. Make sure you tune in for this week's outro. I think we got a lot to talk about with this episode. Because, again, there's things that we've heard on this episode that haven't really been discussed in this kind of format before, at least on our show, which we're super excited to break down. But listeners, thank y'all for joining us. Viewers, thank y'all for joining us. And Mark, appreciate you as well. And we'll catch everybody back on the next episode from the Southern Outdoorsman Podcast.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.